Chapter 15. There was a lone horseman riding along the northern bank of the Araluen Channel, keeping pace with the ship parallel to their course. The man wore white flowing robes and a white turban on his head, with a wide tail of material that protected his neck from the sun. It was similar in purpose to the keffiyeh that Selethen wore, Will guessed.
"Now, where do you suppose he came from?"
Gundar asked, squinting to gaze more closely at the newcomer.
"There's probably a wadi just behind that crest," Selethen told him.
Gundar looked at him, uncomprehending, and he explained,
"A shallow gully."
Earlier, they had been able to see for some distance across the desert on either side of the channel. At this point, though, the bank rose a little, so that it was several meters higher than the water level. Now they could see no further than the elevated banks.
"Oh, yeah, I see."
Gundar paused.
"What do you think he's up to?"
"I should imagine nothing that's good for us," Selethen told him.
"Hello, he's got friends."
3 more riders had appeared, seeming to rise out of the ground at the top of the bank. They joined with the first rider in a loose formation. None of them seemed to show any interest in the ship that continued to glide along the channel, 60 or 70 meters away from them. Selethen had been right about the quicksand, Alice thought. The riders stayed well back from the crumbling, darker shaded ground at the edge of the channel. Holt studied them and could make out the short cavalry bows slung across their backs. Selethen's people used such bows. They were effective at close range, but lost power after 50 or 60 meters. Still, there was no harm in being prepared. "Will," he said quietly, "fetch our bows, would you?" Will gave him a quick glance, then nodded. Their bows were stored in the low, enclosed sleeping quarters in the stern of the ship. He hurried away to get them. "Expecting trouble, Holt?" Evelyn asked. The ranger shrugged. "It'd be silly not to," he said, "unless you can suggest a reason why those 4 riders just happened to be riding alongside us." 7, Evelyn told him. Holt looked again to see that their number had indeed grown. He also saw that Evelyn's sling had appeared in her hand and was swinging slowly back and forth in a pendulum motion. There was obviously a missile loaded into the pouch at its center. He smiled grimly at her. "Bit far for that stone chucker of yours," he said, and Evelyn shrugged. "You never know. Besides," she pointed past the bow, "the channel seems to be narrowing." They all looked forward then, and they could see that she was right. Sandbanks had formed on the northern side of the channel, cutting the width down considerably. Holt rubbed his beard as he studied them. Not sure that they'll be able to come any closer, even with that. Those banks look pretty soft to me." Will returned and handed Holt his bow and quiver of arrows. He had his own quiver slung over his shoulder, and both his bow and Holt's were already strung. Holt nodded his thanks and flexed the bowstring experimentally.
"Maybe we should edge over to the south bank anyway," Selethen suggested.
That side, they could see, was significantly clear of sandbars. The bank itself seemed to be cut straight and clean, rising almost vertically from the water to a height of 5 or 6 meters. "It's very inviting," Holt said. "Perhaps too much so."
"You're right, Ranger,"
Gundar told him. His sailor's eyes, used to looking for signs of submerged obstacles, had detected several suspicious eddies on the surface on the southern side of the channel.
"I'd say there are obstructions just below the surface on that side, waiting for us to get tangled up on them."
"Sandbars, you mean?" Selethen asked.
Gundar shook his head. "More likely spikes and logs and heavy cables set to stop us and hold us fast."
"So the lads beyond the ridge on that side can come visit us at their leisure," Holt put in. He had been studying the south bank, suspicious of the fact that the riders on the north bank had revealed themselves, and that the southern part of the channel seemed to offer safety. A few seconds previously, he had caught a flash of light, as if the sun had briefly reflected off a sword or helmet. He was willing to bet there were several score of warriors concealed on the south bank, waiting for the moment when the ship became entangled in the underwater barriers that Gundar had detected. He told the others what he had seen, and they all looked carefully at the south bank. After a few seconds, Will caught sight of a small movement as well. "There's someone there, all right," he said. "And there are quite a few of them," Selathan added. "There's just the faintest haze of dust in the air where they've been moving into position. Not enough wind to disperse it." "I guess they expected our attention to be focused on the riders," Alice said. Even as she said it, the 7 horsemen on the north bank spurred their horses to move a little ahead of the ship. Then they reined in and unslung their bows, fitting arrows to their bowstrings. Holt glanced warningly at Gundar, but the Skirl had seen the movement. "Shields on the bulwarks!" he called, and the relief rowing crew clambered down into the rowing well and set 8 of the big Scandian shields in brackets on the bulwark to cover the rowers. In many years of raiding and fighting, the Scandians had been shot at before and knew how to protect themselves. "I doubt they have the range to reach us," Holt said, "but it never hurts to play it safe." They heard the familiar clatter and hiss of the arrows leaving the bows and arcing through the air towards the ship. As Holt had predicted, the range was too great for the short bows. 6 of the arrows fell harmlessly into the water. The 7th struck the hull a metre above the waterline, but, devoid of energy, it dropped away with a dull splash. "Out of range," Will said. "You were right." "I'm not sure if they really meant to hit us or just divert our attention," Holt replied. "But either way, I think we might show them it's a bad idea to ride along there." He knocked an arrow to his own bowstring. Will did the same. The riders released another volley, which again fell short of Wolfwill. "Take the one at the back with the purple turban, Will. I'll take the one beside him," Holt said quietly. Will nodded. "Now," said Holt, and they brought their bows up, drew, and released in almost one movement. The 2 arrows, one black and one grey, shot away, climbing into the hot air, then arcing down. The riders Holt had singled out were in the act of shooting again when the 2 long, heavy arrows hissed down and struck them. Holt's target yelled in pain, dropping his bow and clutching at the arrow that had suddenly slammed into his upper arm. The man in the purple turban made no sound. He toppled sideways out of his saddle and hit the brown sand with a dull thud. There were yells of confusion as their 5 companions scattered in panic. The message was all too clear. Their own volleys had fallen short of the target, while the 2 return shots had hit targets at the rear of their group, farthest from the ship, which meant all of them were within easy range. Suddenly, they felt very, very exposed. They wheeled their horses away from the bank and rode over the crest to safety, the riderless horse following them. Only the man in the purple turban remained, lying unmoving on the sand. A few seconds later, the men on the south bank seemed to realize that their ambush had been detected. They appeared above the crest of the bank, waving weapons and yelling insults and curses at the ship as it glided arrogantly by. There were over 2 score of them, raggedly dressed and armed with an assortment of swords, spears, and daggers, with several short bows among them. The bowmen shot a few ragged volleys, but they were all well short of the ship. Will looked at Holt, then glanced down at the bow in his hands, but the bearded ranger shook his head. "Leave them," Holt said. "They can't hurt us, and now they know it's safer to leave us alone." He turned to Gundar. All the same, it might not be a good idea to anchor anywhere midstream for a rest. The sun was setting astern of them, a giant ball turned blood red by the tiny particles of sand that hung in the desert air, when they slipped quietly out of the Araluen Channel into the Blood Sea, a narrow gulf that led eventually to the wide spaces of the Eastern Ocean. I guess that's where the name comes from, Will said, jerking a thumb at the water's surface behind them. The intense glow of the sunset was reflected in the surface of the water, turning it to the same spectacular red color, shimmering and shifting on the waves as they trapped and reflected the last light of the day so that the water itself looked like a sea of blood. A gentle sea breeze sprang up from the south once they were several hundred meters offshore. It was warm, but nonetheless welcome, after the stultifying heat that had engulfed them as they rode through the channel. "Make sail," Gundar ordered. In the absence of roaring wind and waves, he could give his commands in a much calmer voice than his normal bellow. The sail handlers hurried to unfurl the port sail and hoist the slender boom that supported it to the masthead. As the wind caught the canvas and it bellied out, he gave more quick orders. "Sheet home, in oars!" The long oars rose, dripping from the water. There were a few seconds of clattering and banging as the rowers drew them inboard and stowed them along the line of the ship. At the same time, the sailing crew hauled in on the sheets controlling the triangular sail. Initially bellying out loosely in the wind, it now hardened into a smooth, efficient curve, and the passengers felt the harnessed thrust of the wind take effect. Wolfwill heeled a little to port, then Gundar leaned his weight on the tiller, heading the ship at right angles to the wind. "Loosen off!" he called. He could sense that the sail, sheeted too tightly, was causing the ship to heel further than was necessary, and this was costing them speed. Wolfwill steadied, came a little more upright, then swooped over a long, slow swell like a gull. Gundar looked around at his passengers and couldn't help grinning at them. "I never get tired of that," he said, and they smiled in return. The ship's motion was exhilarating, particularly after the hours of heat and tension as they passed through the Araluen Channel. "So, what can we expect from the Blood Sea, Gundar?" Will asked the big burly Scandian. Gundar braced the tiller with his hip and spread the Genovesean sailing notes on the small chart table beside him. He consulted the carefully lettered script for a few minutes, then looked up at Will. "At this time of year, we should have steady winds," he said. "Although, in a month or two, there'll be a good chance of being becalmed." Sailors, Will noted, always wanted you to know the worst news, even when things were looking good. "And," Gundar continued, "the notes say to avoid other ships as much as possible. Apparently the sea here is crawling with pirates." "Pirates?" Holt asked. Gundar nodded, jerking a thumb at the notes. "That's what it says here, pirates." Holt raised both his eyebrows for once. "Pirates," he said. "Oh, goody."